Well, I guess it is time we started. So, dear attendees and participants of our conversation, I am extremely delighted to present our special guest, Dr. Vivian Walker, who is the Executive Director of the United States Advisory Commission on Public Diplomacy at the Department of State. In her 26-year career with the State Department, Dr. Vivian Walker rose to the senior rank of Minister Counselor. She twice served as a Deputy Chief of Mission in Croatia and Armenia, the Public Affairs Officer in Kazakhstan with coverage of Tajikistan and Turkmenistan, a Cultural Affairs Officer in Tunisia, and an Information Officer in Haiti. Thank you for being with us today, and please welcome Dr. Vivian Walker.
Thank you so much for the invitation and for the opportunity to join you in what I hope will be a conversation. It looks like we are a relatively small group, like a seminar format, so that's great for my purposes. I think the plan is that I will go through these slides, but I will try to do it as rapidly as possible so that we actually have time for a good conversation about the issues. So with that, I will turn to my slides.
All right.
So in that very kind introduction, I think gave you a hint of my professional experience. But what I wanted to reinforce is what I did after I left the diplomatic service, and that is to enter into the world of teaching and promoting diplomacy, and more specifically, public diplomacy. So I come at the question of the nature of public diplomacy as an instrument of statecraft, not just from the perspective of a practitioner, someone who spent a number of years in the field working on these issues, but then more recently as someone who is attempting to teach these, to identify practice, and in really and ultimately to support the next generation of future policymakers, diplomats, civilian and military officials, all of you who are here today, for example, who will ultimately take responsibility for many of the issues that we discussed today. And so that's why in this particular presentation, I want to talk about public diplomacy as an instrument of statecraft, but I also want to talk about it as a craft and what it requires as future practitioners, future policymakers, have an idea of how to prepare yourselves for this type of theory, but also practice. So let's then start, as any good professor does, right, with talking a little bit about broad theories. So I talk about public diplomacy as an instrument of statecraft. What do I mean by an instrument of statecraft? Well, those of you who are studying international relations may have already come across this particular form of IR theory, but this is, when we talk about tools or instruments of statecraft, we're talking about the tools that a government uses in order to pursue its national security interests, its economic interests. And in general, at least with respect to foreign policy engagement, there are four categories or groupings of instruments. There is the diplomatic instrument, using diplomacy and negotiations to achieve national objectives. There is, of course, the military component, right? And I don't think I need to explain much about that to you. There is the economic tools that could be trade and negotiations and tariffs and sanctions. And then, of course, there is the information instrument of power. And that is both overt and covert, as you might imagine. We are not talking about the covert use of information today. And by the covert use of information, I'm talking about the use of intelligence gathering, to inform policymakers, to create the best conditions for policy successes. Today, rather, we're going to talk about the overt use of information as a tool of statecraft, and particularly public diplomacy, and we think about it in terms of what a government does to inform and influence external audiences, maybe even to shift their behaviors and their perceptions, all in the service of national security and economic priorities. So that's the broad definition of tools. I will say that none of these tools that I have just described, diplomatic, information, military, and economic, exist in a vacuum. You use them all at the same time across this spectrum between peace and war. In other words, any diplomatic engagement will involve, for example, the use of information outreach. It may not directly use military force, but it may be a diplomatic engagement in lieu of or to prevent resorting to the use of military instruments, or it may be a negotiation or meetings to deal with the consequences of conflict. And of course, any diplomatic negotiation may involve economics, incentives, or sanctions. So none of these instruments exist in isolation. But that said, we are going to focus specifically on the information instrument in this presentation. So what do I mean by this little arrow you see in front of us? Well, most of us in the policy world and in the academic world, I would argue, want to find ourselves on the left-hand side of the arrow, right? Focusing, keeping us and our interests and our countries and our institutions closer to the state of peace. And in that realm, we use sort of soft power tools of information outreach that are generally persuasive, that try to make an argument to an audience to bring them over to your perspective or point of view. Moving along the spectrum closer to conflict, in the middle there, we have what Hillary Clinton and others called smart power. That is to say, power used, information power used to give something to get something. So giving information or sharing training opportunities in order to perhaps bring about a shift in attitudes or behaviors. And on the far right end of our spectrum here, of course, we find ourselves in the use of the hard power use of information, or sharp power, as many people call it today. And that is the coercive use of information, information used to destabilize or threaten or distort or dismay. And I don't need to tell you, the citizens of Ukraine, about the consequences of the coercive use of information, such as disinformation, currently exercised by the Russian Federation. So, the use of the information instrument then falls along that entire spectrum and brings us to this definition that should now be quite clear from Joseph Nye. And if you haven't read the writings of Joseph Nye, I highly recommend them in terms of understanding soft power. Power is the ability, he says, to affect others to get the outcomes one prefers. I think that's probably the simplest and clearest statement, the use of the information instrument of power. And that can be accomplished by coercion, payment, or attraction and persuasion. Soft power is the ability to obtain preferred outcomes by attraction rather than coercion or payment. So soft power and public diplomacy. All right, so what's public diplomacy? Well, I've given you already a pretty broad definition. You see it up there. Informing and influencing audiences for the purpose of promoting national interests. Here is a quick taxonomy of information and influence. This came from an article that Nicholas Kull, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with Nicholas Kull. He spoke most recently, I think, as the keynote speaker at the Ukrainian Institute's presentation last week on culture. But anyway, and he has a book that covers these issues, but this comes from an earlier article of his called Taxonomies and Histories of Public Diplomacy. And if you don't want to buy the book, this is a much better option. But in this article, he lays out a basic framework for information and influence that I think is worth understanding. So there are 5 aspects to this taxonomy. He has listening to audiences, understanding your audiences first and foremost, advocacy, promotion of specific policy objectives. And this advocacy is generally a sort of short-term effort, often responding to crises or situations. Then in the middle there, you have cultural diplomacy, which is exporting your national culture or artistic identifiers to make the case for your country. Exchange diplomacy and promoting understanding, and finally talking about the use of international broadcasting, public funded international broadcasting institutions that on the one hand provide objective information, but on the other hand also advocate for particular policies or approaches. Examples of the international broadcasting entities would include Al Jazeera or BBC, or the US Agency for Global Media in the United States, Voice of America. The Ukraine does not currently have an international broadcasting component, although there is a component that is focused on individuals in the occupied territories. We're not going to talk that much about international broadcasting today. In fact, we are going to focus our discussion today primarily on the first two, listening and advocacy. The only other thing I'd like to point out of note is that of all of these activities, it is absolutely significant that Dr. Call put listening first, not advocacy, not getting the message out. He put listening first because, and we will develop this at some length through this conversation today, understanding your audiences is the absolute first step toward any kind of information outreach activity. Why? Because if you don't understand your audiences and what they care about and what they believe or what they think they understand about you, your country, your institutions, then your messaging may not be effective. So we'll talk a little more about that. So digging a little bit deeper into soft power, we have already seen these definitions from Nye. Here's the point that I want to focus on. In international politics, there are three elements of soft power. And they are the values that an organization or country expresses, so particular deep held beliefs and principles. Second is internal practices, how a country or institution governs, how it treats its people, its citizens. And third, how a government or an institution handles its external relations. The understanding of the values, internal practice, those who produce the messaging. Soft power is how audiences perceive those values. This is why audience is so important, because the impression of a country and its behaviors lies in the minds of the observers, how it comes across. And that's what makes effective public diplomacy so challenging, because if public diplomacy were just a matter of government to government communication, we wouldn't be having this conversation today. But the fact is that public diplomacy is an instrument used to affect the publics of other countries. Well, how many publics are there in a country? Can't even begin to count, right? And if you think how many in an oblast, no, too many. How many in a city? How many in a rayon? How many in a building? How many audiences do we have together? What, we are 17 or 20 right now? Each of us is a separate audience, and each of us in this very moment brings a different set of expectations, perceptions, experiences. Okay, there are some commonalities amongst us, right? We're here today because we share an interest in these issues, perhaps, but as an audience, as receptors, how we respond to what we're learning, unique. That makes the practice of public diplomacy so challenging. Again, this is from my friend Joseph Nye. Okay, so those are some of the big picture concepts. We're done. But when I talk about the instruments of power and public diplomacy and soft power, I hope you're pretty comfortable with these terms. So now let's talk a little bit about the context in which public diplomacy is practiced. So we've got a global information environment. And as you know, that brings enormous possibilities, right? There is access to information is virtually unlimited. It's not bounded by time. It's not bounded by space or geography. So that's extraordinarily empowering, but there is a downside to this incredible availability of information. And that is what, again, Joseph Nye calls the paradox of plenty. Plenty of information gives rise, not paradoxically, to greater understanding, but rather to a scarcity of attention. There is so much information for intended or unintended audiences to choose from. You know, it is impossible to know how audiences will direct their intention. This has consequences. First of all, in this realm, you have multiple competitors for audience attention, right? A near infinite number. Then of those multiple audiences, you have the audiences you think you want to reach, but there will be many other audiences out there for whom you have not prepared your messaging or your outreach initiatives who will see it one way or another and respond to it. And because you haven't anticipated those audiences, you have no way of really anticipating their response. And yet their responses in this environment can be consequential. Then you have multiple sets of competing values. Now let's go back to that definition of the 3 elements of soft power. And I said, number 1 was the values that a country projects. Well, here's the problem. One country's definition and value and appreciation for a certain value may not resonate with another country or or particular audiences in another country who may see the same issue in a very different way. Let me give you an obvious example from the US experience. Every time in the United States, we were dealing with some kind of an attack on or desecration of Islam. Think about the Quran burning, or think about the Netherlands cartoons, Charlie Hebdo. When the United States government messaged about these events, the message said, of course, we deplore violence and we deplore religious intolerance, but we totally uphold our value, which is freedom of expression. The individual who was setting fire to Qurans was completely within his rights to set a match to those holy texts. Now, vast majority of the audiences out there probably get that and the primacy of freedom of expression, but to those audiences perhaps most likely to be upset by the desecration of the Quran, that may not sound like a valuation of freedom of expression. That may sound much more like a promotion of religious intolerance. That is one of the really challenging problems of values projection in public diplomacy. So what happens, and we all do this, when there's too much information out there, generally people go with what they know, what's familiar, what their friends or their teachers are saying, or they are attracted to news and information that confirm what they already think that they believe. It's very hard to change minds or to get people to think outside of their channels in this environment. And yet often in public diplomacy and in targeted advocacy messaging, we are trying to get people to change their minds, or we are trying to explain something that they don't like or don't approve of. So how do you break through those existing beliefs and perceptions to make your case? Ultimately, then this narrows the scope of understanding. Then there is what, the velocity and speed of information. I'm not going to dwell on that. You know exactly what I'm talking about. It's really as things happen, an event, something happens, a bombing, an action of some kind, and already the world is reporting about it before a government or an institution can even figure out what happened and what to say about it, right? But that is a problem, and it does challenge your capacity to communicate. But I also want to remind ourselves that that is a perennial problem. This quote here, you see about the speed of communications, it could have been written today. but it actually came from 1964. And it came from the then director of the US Information Agency, which was our independent public diplomacy institution in the United States. And the reality is that every time there is a shift in technology and technological capacities in communication, whether we're going from the movie reel to shortwave and medium wave, to films, to satellite television, to the internet, every shift in the way in which we communicate has created new challenges for the ability to message effectively in that environment, and a need to keep up with the technology, in fact, to use those the very new technologies in order to be competitive. And then there is this very disturbing erosion of public trust. This actually comes from Francis Fukuyama, another very interesting person to read if you want to think about what he calls the post-fact world. And what he tells us, and I think he's right, is that we find ourselves in a world where all formerly authoritative information sources are called into question and can be challenged by fake news. And then there is this sense that all institutions are corruptible and possibly even corrupted. So there's a lack of faith in media platforms, and there is a lack of faith in the institutions that are projecting these values and messages. And that is also very damaging to the ability to message effectively. This last little image here is actually drawn from Ukraine, from an interesting study that, if you haven't seen, I recommend, that talks about distrust that exists within Ukraine with respect to certain narratives. So you are, if you're practicing public diplomacy and attempting to message on behalf of your government or institution, remember that you're operating in an atmosphere of distrust and of a certain amount of disillusion. So, consequences. Simon Anholt says, and I think he's right, that there is only one superpower on the planet. That superpower is public opinion. Because as I'm going back to what I said earlier about the elements of soft power really existing in the minds of the beholders, it is the beholders, the audience, the public opinion, that makes the decision about whether to accept a particular point of view or change their behaviors. And indeed, the public is not merely, is not the ultimate consumer of information. The public is also now the ultimate producer of information. Everybody is at the same time a consumer and a producer. And that is extremely powerful, but it is also power, as we all know, that can be very, very easily distorted and manipulated. So more consequences. We're dealing with what I call the declining power of the source, where information comes from, right? Because news and information items are now disaggregated. They're broken out from the original story, the original event or sequence of events, and broken into bits and parts and distributed. And it is the absence of context or understanding of the origin story of this information that can lead to manipulation or deception. News and information items are compartmentalized and distributed, right? We know this all too well in social media platforms according to very specific economic and political and social profiles. Your likes, your interests, your purchases end up dictating the information that you receive. This means that the burden of source credibility assessment shifts to the consumer. Well, again, that's empowering, but not all consumers of information are like you here today, right? You, I imagine, are extremely acute and perceptive information consumers. When you see a story, how many sources do you go to? You know where to go to get different versions of the story. You know how to look at multiple avenues to be able to put together an understanding of what really happened. You also know that this is a habit of mind and it takes work. And the majority of audiences out there might not have the experience or the ability or even the desire to engage in that credibility assessment. And that is the majority of the audiences that you're trying to reach. So this ends up with, you end up with in a place of profound strategic vulnerability, as our friend from the, as a former Israeli intelligence officer says here. You can do whatever you want. You can be whatever you want. It's a place where wars are fought, elections are won, and terror is promoted. There are no regulations. And in this space, a lion may only be a kitty cat, and a kitty cat may turn out to be a lion. The danger in this space is, how do you know the difference? How do you know when you're dealing with a cat? And how do you know when you're dealing with a lion? And if there are authorities or influencers out there with the intent to confuse the cat from the lion, then we're in trouble. Okay, so now I've laid out sort of the big theory pieces of this, and I'm happy in the Q&A section to go back and elaborate on any one of these ideas. I put a lot out there in a very short amount of time. But I also promised you that I would talk about, I would bring it down to the level of craft. So what do you do in practice? Now that I've outlined this extremely daunting and challenging information space, how do you address it? And so I'm going to give you some examples and remind you that, again, going back to Nick Cull's taxonomy, we're focusing right now on number 1 and number 2, the listening piece and the short-term advocacy or messaging piece. This discussion does not address the longer-term investment in cultural or exchange programs. Again, I can talk about that separately or in the Q&A to talk about how they contribute overall to the promotion of national security and prosperity. But right now, for our purposes, we're going to focus on the short-term efforts. What a country or an institution has to do in the short term to correct or improve its image or correct or protect perceptions of its interests. So there is a classic framework about how to approach strategic communication, public diplomacy, and you see it right here. You notice that it's in a circle with arrows, so it's kind of a never-ending cycle. These, again, are not discrete, one set of activities bleeds into another, and they're interrelated, but in general, there is a process. And it begins by figuring out, so why are we messaging in the first place? You know, what is it that we want to achieve with this campaign? And it may be, you know, specific interests and values that are being promoted, or there may be a threat out there, or a problem, or an opportunity. So, but you need to be very clear at the outset why you're doing it. Now, at this point, the temptation is to jump right to the message. We are trying to promote a particular value. So our message is going to be wrong. The next step is, who are your audiences? You say you want to promote a particular value, or you want to address a particular threat or opportunity. Who are the audiences you need to reach in order to, shift their behaviors or perceptions in a way that support those interests or protect them? And it's not simply a matter, because I've seen this. Well, I'll reach out to youth, and then I'll reach out to policymakers, and maybe some journalists. No, that's not audience identification. It's understanding what individuals within those broad groups, youth, journalists, academics, which of those do we need to reach to pursue these specific objectives, and what do they already think about them? Now, Because generally the assumption is, oh, people are open and receptive, they understand what's going on. Not necessarily the case. So some of your audiences are going to be informed, others are not. Some audiences are going to have certain preconceptions, others are not. You have to understand what those are, and then and only then work on your message content. Directing and developing content that specifically speaks to a particular audience and what they think, what their attitudes are about the issues. Then you put together your implementation plan, whatever platforms you may choose to promote it. And then, and here's the other piece of it on the left there, is assessing the outcome. Certainly for those of us who've worked in government, and for those of you who will work in government, guess what? Everything goes by the budget and by the fiscal year. And you get your government to invest in certain kinds of programs and activities, but then you also have to be able to show how the return for what was the return for the investment. So it is important to understand, to the extent that you can, how effective this particular campaign was. And it's not merely to justify the continuation of expenditures on this, but also to understand, was that the best use of resources? If the campaign didn't work so well, why not? And what could we change to make it better? And so if you like to think about, you look at the assess outcome and the identify audiences, and they're both really about what? They're about audience. So audiences bookend this whole process, because you assess outcomes by, analyzing media stories, polling, all these things. So it starts with the audience and essentially it ends with the audience. Okay, so all this theory is great, right? Let's look at an example. And I'm going to pick an example from my own country of a failure. I know we too often we have speakers who tell you about success stories. I happen to think that you learn a lot more from failures than success stories, right? But in any event, here's an example of a campaign failure. And this grew out of the 9/11 attacks on the United States. And as probably most of you are too young to remember it, but you certainly have read about or heard about the impacts of 9/11, and particularly in the United States, in addition to the sort of the sheer tragedy of the attacks and the scale and scope and implications, was also this sense, as then President Bush articulated in a press conference at the time, the problem is that we just haven't done a good job of telling our story. The rest of the world, and in particular the Muslim world, just doesn't understand us. And if they understood us better as people, and what our values are, what we care about, then perhaps something like 9/11 wouldn't have happened. So the strategic problem, what the top line issue that was in play here was, we've got hostile Muslim world perceptions that pose a threat to national security and national legitimacy, all right? And so our foreign policies objectives were at risk, the freedom agenda, the promotion of liberty and prosperity as an alternative to violence. Our values and interests were at risk, the religious freedom, ethnic diversity, and pluralism, negative perceptions of America in this regard, and of course, cultural values with respect to faith, family, and community. So all of this led to a plan called the Shared Values Outreach Campaign. And the bottom line was, we are all the same under the skin. We all share basic values, faith, family, community, and the target audience was, broadly speaking, the Muslim world, and also strategic partners and allies. And the message roughly was, America is a country of faith and family, where Muslims, along with everybody else, can live in peace and prosperity. And there you see a picture there on the bottom right are some Muslim American girls enjoying iftar, breaking of the fast during Ramadan. So the implementation, TV, radio, newspaper campaigns and mass media placements. This was, by the way, pre-social media. So that's why there's no social media listed as a tool. But at the time, going back to what I was saying about using the best available tools, those were the most cutting edge tools that we had at the time to be able to promote this campaign. Well, then we came to the impact assessment. And here's where it gets interesting. Assessment of responses showed that the campaign was not taken seriously by global audiences. It didn't work. Why? Because of a faulty perception or understanding of Muslim audience outrage. The Muslim world, particularly the individuals who engaged in the attacks, were really not upset about American values. They weren't concerned whether America embraced faith or family or community. They were upset about American policies in the Middle East across the board. So here is a great example where the strategic priorities, what it is that we want to achieve, seem to jump directly to the messaging campaign without really thinking about the most important audiences out there, which is the ones who are not necessarily worried about American values, but unhappy with our policies and our practices. So there's where a failure to really think about and understand what the audiences care about led to campaign failure. So now quickly, let's talk about a successful campaign, and I'm going to use one from Switzerland. Now, Switzerland, as you know, has a reputation. I know when you think of Switzerland, or at least I do, was I think of banks and Red Cross and ski chalets and hot chocolate and generally good chocolate and neutrality. But there was a period in the late 90s where there was a lot of criticism for Switzerland's role in World War II as a place where the Nazis deposited their gold and other reserves. And this campaign became a serious image problem for Switzerland, which prided itself upon, in fact, its neutrality, its absolute probity in its handling of financial transactions. And this perception of Swiss support for the Nazi regime actually ended up being a threat to their economic and political security, because their economic and political security depended upon their reputation in the finance and sector and their supposed political neutrality. So clear evidence of issues at risk and political values at risk, and as well as cultural values. The view of Switzerland as a tolerant, ethical country with a certain sort of moral and fiscal authority, all of that was at risk. And when you think about what Switzerland's industry is, which is essentially its finance sector, that's a very significant threat to the country. So the country put together a Presence Switzerland campaign that coordinated government, public, and private sector stakeholders. Now, admittedly, much easier to do in Switzerland than, for example, the United States, where it's almost impossible to achieve that level of coordination among all of these entities. So that's an important qualifier. But they were very careful in thinking about their target audiences. Did they want to reach the whole world on this? No. They identified who are their key business, commercial partner nations, and who are their key sort of political allies, where these negative perceptions about Switzerland would be most damaging. So that's narrowing down the field, right? And then within that, they fixed on certain opinion makers and business leaders who would be in the position of influencing perceptions. Their message, joint action, joint promotion, and their implementation, they focused this effort on a series of promotional exhibits at global fairs and expos. I don't know if any of you have been to a global fair, but this is an opportunity for countries to talk about their businesses, their brands, their politics, their potential. And so through a series of targeted exhibits about a positive vision of Switzerland, there was ultimately over time a definite shift trending positive in global attitudes toward Switzerland. And certainly the campaign was part of it. I should also add, though, going back to the second element of soft power that Joseph Nye gave us, which is internal governance practices, Switzerland also engaged in a series of reforms, legislative reforms to the banking sector that reinforced Switzerland's commitment to dealing with all parties in an ethical and transparent way. So it wasn't simply a messaging campaign, but it was a campaign that was supported by actual changes in behavior in Switzerland. And of course, the Swiss made a point of messaging about those legislative actions as well, which certainly helped to reinforce good perceptions of Switzerland. And as you see here in looking at success, thinking very carefully about their audiences and who they needed to reach, limiting the scope, not trying to take on everything. And in that sense, then assuring themselves a better chance of success. Okay, so now we've gone from 50,000 foot to the practicality of how you actually put together a campaign. So now let's come all the way down to the level of the individual. So, because I've been asked over and over again, what skills are required to be effective in public diplomacy? There you have it, my own skills pyramid. At the bottom there, the base, or the technical skills in public diplomacy, but in any kind of communicating or advocacy on behalf of an institution or a movement. You have to be able to write effectively, speak effectively. You have to have good research skills, particularly for those interested in international business or foreign affairs. Language proficiency is a must. And you need to be familiar with, of course, what the tools and platforms. I'm always dismayed when people go to think about technical skills for public diplomacy, and the only thing they can come up with is improved digital social media skills. That is only a fraction of it. If you don't know how to write, if you don't know how to present, if you don't know how to research your sources and methods, what good are your digital media skills? So we have to, the social media skills and tools, important, but along with all of these other skills. The next level up is what I refer to as habits of mind. And that is, can you listen? And I mean actively listen. I had that quote earlier in the slide presentation. Most people don't listen with the intent to really listen, but listen with the intent to respond. If you're going to understand your audiences, if you're going to be able to come up with an effective counter disinformation campaign, for example, or a messaging campaign, you need to understand what your audiences think first and foremost, and then be able to analyze it. Can you argue persuasively? There is a difference between telling someone about how he or she should think about something, right? And using persuasive argumentation to bring that person around to your point of view. Critical thinking, not taking anything as fact, but assessing and analyzing, and relationship building. So much of effective public diplomacy, particularly in-person public diplomacy, is building a relationship of trust and credibility. Are you someone that people can trust? If you are, then when you say something or ask people to do something, they're far more likely to do it or to listen to you. Relationship building is essential. Moving up the ladder, collaborative skills. You got to know your institution, whether it is the Ukrainian Ministry of Foreign Affairs or the Department of State or any other institution. You need to understand what your institution's missions, its bureaucracies, and core and policies, essential. And then up there, context, just a general cultural, historical, and social awareness, particularly when you are either living and working in a foreign country or you're at home in Ukraine working for the ministry, but preparing products or initiatives that are going to be used in a particular external environment. If you don't have a pretty good understanding of that country's history and culture and attitudes in society, again, what you put together may not resonate. And then I stuck vision at the top because there is sort of this sense of vision or purpose or mission that brings this all together. Now, having dragged you through this for public diplomacy, it should be clear to you that these skills could be applied to just about any endeavor. I mean, a thoracic surgeon, an architect. All right, there may be some slightly different technical skills, particularly, a heart surgeon or an architect. There may be, there are basic skills that are going to be different. But everything else I described is all part of being effective, particularly when you're in a business that is persuading or enticing or attracting or serving people, which is just about all, most of what people do. So that is something to keep in mind. But there are the public diplomacy skills, and I'd be happy to talk about them. But it wouldn't be me if I didn't close out with what I think are some of the more interesting meta or philosophical questions. Right? And I'm hoping that you will be interested in these as well. First of all, how do we maintain the sanctity of the last 3 feet? I just mentioned in the skills pyramid, right, that relationship building, that credibility is so important. And Edward R. Murrow, whom I quoted earlier, the director of the US Information Agency, said many, many years ago that the most important public diplomacy happens in the last 3 feet between one person talking to another person. In this virtual environment, and with the overlay now of COVID, how do we maintain that credibility of direct engagement? What happens to this contact in a world that increasingly privileges or has to default to virtual encounters? What does that mean for the practice of public diplomacy? These are, by the way, are big questions. I didn't say I was going to answer them. That's up to you. How do we promote unique cultural and information products in a world where anything and everything is now accessible online? What defines national identity and values? I can tell you something that the Ukrainian Institute is working on right now is how do we define Ukraine for audiences abroad? What are the national characteristics and quality of our country? What is the story that we want to tell about our country that on the one hand makes it stand out and be unique, but at the same time demonstrates a set of shared values or beliefs or principles? That's a real challenge. And finally, and this is a real question this is your generation has got to solve this problem. Social media platforms like Facebook, they seem to have the right to decide what information should be shared. Should they have that right? What distinguishes freedom of expression in this mediated online environment? What is the difference between freedom of speech, going back to that value I was talking about earlier, and freedom of reach, the freedom to reach out, the freedom to target, the freedom to do business, which is, after all, what Facebook and all of these other entities are, their businesses. So with that, I'm happy to take your answers to these questions or anything else. And Victoria, I think I should probably stop sharing and just go into screen mode. Yeah.
Right. So first of all, thank you for the lecture. And I guess it's our Q&A session. So let's make the following thing. So whether you want to raise your hand and make sure to ask the question or write it in the chat box, right? And if nobody minds, my first question will concern Ukraine. So in your personal opinion, what tools or what instruments of public policy are the most applicable in the Ukrainian case in order to represent Ukraine to its best advantage?
I think that in general, external audiences are aware of and sympathetic to Ukraine. Because if people are aware of Ukraine, they are also aware of what has happened to Ukraine, 2014, 2015 and beyond, with the occupation, the annexation, and the war that's being fought in the information space against Ukraine as well as on the ground. So I think there is an understanding and appreciation for Ukraine as a victim of these attacks. And I think there is a fair amount of understanding and appreciation for Ukraine as as we say in English, the plucky underdog. You know, the person who's a country that's at a disadvantage, but by God fights back with courage and honor and dignity. You have that going for you, but that's not going to be enough. And I think the challenge that Ukraine has is to probably step away a little bit from the victim narrative, because, you know, I think that's a given. Rather focus on what story can we tell about Ukraine that illustrates its potential. Its potential as a strategic partner, so detailing, for example, its existing contributions to NATO. Its potential as an economic partner, not just in the EU context, but some of its economic relationships in the region. Telling the story of its humanitarian assistance, you know, in everything from as recently as, you know, support of the Afghan refugees to other instances. And there are numerous instances of the Ukrainian government stepping in and providing humanitarian assistance. So I think the focus needs to be on projecting a story about Ukraine that shows it as a viable partner in the three elements of soft power that I talked about. It's what Ukraine values as a country and as a nation, the values piece. Secondly, it's, you know, what Ukraine is doing to promote democratic institution building and fight corruption in its own country, the internal governments. And thirdly, how Ukraine can and has the potential to do even more, interact effectively with its partners in the region and around the world.
Oh, thank you. And I have another question. So a couple of years ago, in one of your interviews, you stated that the power of public diplomacy had been a little bit underrated and underestimated. So what about now? So what about the current situation? Do you think that more and more politicians value it more, or still it is a little bit underestimated?
I can't remember which interview that was, but I think was I talking about public diplomacy within a government institution, right?
Yeah, probably,
yeah. Okay. So here's the problem. Public diplomacy is always underrated and overrated at the same time. It's underrated because they think, oh, well, it's just, you know, it's just a, you know, a press conference or maybe a hip hop group or an art exhibit. You know, it's culture. I mean, who cares about culture, right? Culture is not going to win wars. So in that sense, I think public diplomacy and the importance of having public diplomacy at the table when important national security decisions are being made, that is a perennial problem. At the same time, public diplomacy is overrated because politicians, and I will say now that I'm retired, certain of my former bosses in the Department of State had they had the expectation that if we just tell them our story, that will be enough. If we just put our messages out there, we're done. When a country's policies are at issue, when its actions and behaviors are the source of the problem, as we saw in that shared values campaign, no amount of messaging about values is going to shift that perception. And so I think that the challenge that public diplomacy practitioners face, whether they're sitting in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine or the Department of State, is how do we, on the one hand, demonstrate public diplomacy's real potential as an important component of national security and foreign policy initiatives, but at the same time manage expectations about what can be actually achieved.
Well, thank you for the answer. And guys, so feel free to raise your hands. So we have one question from Ivan Vajinsky, please.
Thank you very much for this informative speech. And my question is that now China and Russia tries to implement a new system of diplomacy. I mean, I talk about sharp power when China uses an instrument of the democratic system and tries to encourage its values in other countries. Nevertheless, it tries to neglect the same rules in its territory. I mean, the last case with, for example, BBC News Agency in China and Russia do the same. They're the same. And the question is how public diplomacy can fight against it and what can be done with it. Thank you.
That's the great question, and it's the question of the hour. And so the first thing I would correct, though, is that this new sharp power battle, the use of sharp power is as old as war. And the only thing that changes in the use of, in the use of disinformation or authoritarian influence strategies is the technology. So let's be clear that what Russian Federation, China, and many other countries are engaging in terms of the use of authoritarian influence to achieve their strategic goals is something that is as old as war, as old as conflict. But that said, certainly China and Russia, as you say, and other authoritarian countries do use information as a way to promote their own interests, but not for the benefit, to promote the continuation of the regime rather than to promote the interests of the citizens. And to me, that's the fundamental difference between the public diplomacy that democratic countries participate and that versus the influence strategies that authoritarian countries use. They're using it to produce to protect the regime and their own power, and not to promote the interests of their citizens. The challenge that public diplomacy practitioners from democratic nations face is, how do you use soft power tools in a hard power environment? Because if a democratic country starts using the same sharp power tools, then what does that make that country? Indistinguishable from its authoritarian competitors. So the real challenge for public diplomacy is how to engage in these information and influence activities. And make no mistake, democratic nations want to influence as well. We call it democratic influence as opposed to authoritarian influence, but it's still influence, all right? But democratic countries need to do that in the case of the United States, for example, collaboratively. They have to do it transparently. They have to be they have to respect the privacy of individual citizens, so that I talk about listening and understanding audiences, but not through invasive or intrusive methods. In short, in their practice of public diplomacy, of influence, they have to model basic democratic values. And ultimately, that's why I think that those tools will prevail. I think that the people who are being oppressed by authoritarian influence strategies know very well that they're being oppressed. The rest of the world knows what Russia and China and other countries are up to when they use those tools. And the perceptions of their behaviors are negative. By contrast, in continuing to model democratic values in the use of soft power tools, I think ultimately, I think that effort will prevail.
Also, I guess we have a couple of minutes, and if anyone wants to ask a question, this is your time. Well, please, one more question.
If it's possible, I just want to ask about as a theory of troubles and the relation between different civilizations or cultures. And for example, I heard that, I read that it's a big distance between Western world and Western values of democracy, freedom, and so on and so forth, and its perception in the, for example, China or Middle East, and that may be also be the problem because the citizens of that countries don't think that it's important or it's on time.
I agree with part of that. I do think that, yes, there are going to be different interpretations of value sets. And frankly, how could there not be? We are all people, we are all different, and having different interpretations of these value sets is inevitable. I'm not saying that these different interpretations and competing interpretations should go away. I'm simply saying that we need to acknowledge and be aware of and work around and through these competing interpretations, but not to eliminate them, because we're never going to eliminate that. I mean, that's going back to the issues of identity, of culture, of history, of society. We're defined by that. It's not up to, or in no single nation or institution or group of nations should attempt to change someone else's values necessarily, but rather to work through the intended audience's understanding of those values in order to be able to best promote their own interests and objectives.
Thank you very much.
Well, I guess our time is up. So first of all, I would like to express deep gratitude for delivering this lecture. I am convinced that the information that we got, that the new knowledge will be so valuable for us, especially to those who pursue a career in foreign affairs. Well, and thank you so much. And I would also like to express my gratitude to our fellow students who are participating in the organization of this meeting, and namely Simon Ehrenberg, Sofia Yermolenko, and Alexander Smolensky. And so many other students.
Great. Well, thank you so much. It was a pleasure to meet with you virtually, and perhaps we'll have another chance to meet should I be lucky enough to return to Ukraine. Well, so we will wait for you. And in case you're in Kyiv, we will definitely invite you to the Institute just for a face-to-face communication. The last 3 feet. I'd be happy to. I'd be happy to do that. Yes. Thank you, everybody, so much. Thank you so much. Yeah. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everybody.